Hey guys, now it's time to get right into the text, and you're probably going to find the readings start to become much more complex when compared to how we started off reading Descartes. And I'm just going to warn you for that, probably because all the meaning and all the concepts are kind of condensed into smaller spots. In fact, you'll probably find that the writing is clearer, but the concepts are much denser. So you're reading these much more well-structured sentences and paragraphs. However, as you read along, you might get lost because there might be one complex idea that stumps you, and you just need to go back, look it up, make sense of it, and then keep reading along. So, what are we going to do today? Well, we're going to read the introduction section of the prescribed text list. So, we're not actually meant to be reading all of Smart's article, but we're meant to be reading most of it. And what we have to do is read the intro section, which we're prescribed. That is section 141 to 143, a paragraph in 143. And we're going to basically use that section that I've outlined to elaborate on, well, to basically outline an introduction for the rest of the text that we have to read. Okay, so we need to explore four possible hypotheses about how best to reflect on an afterimage, and then identify Smart's preferred hypothesis. So we're going to think about the experience of looking at an afterimage, and then we're going to talk about what that means in terms of mental phenomena and what mental phenomena is, okay? Mental states would be a better word because it refers more to the behaviourist language of Ryle and Armstrong, who were very good friends with Smart. All right, so we'll go over it again. We're going to explore four possible hypotheses about how to reflect on an afterimage and then identify Smart's preferred hypothesis. Right, and that requires three small goals. We need to name, define, and interrelate different terms. We need to then critically evaluate different hypotheses from Smart's perspective. So we go through and we name, define, and interrelate different terms, and we form these hypotheses. Most of them will have a name, or you can formulate a name. And then from that, we need to then create a evaluation of what these hypotheses are, and then we arrive at the logic for accepting just one out of the four. So write these three success criteria down for me, please. And then from there, can you give yourself a score out of 4 for each of them? And then see this image here, you've probably guessed who it is, but I still want you to do it because it'll give you something to relate to. Once you've scored yourself on these success criteria, have a look at this image for 30 seconds and then immediately stare at a white piece of paper, a blank white piece of paper, and tell me who you see. Okay, so again, what we need to just keep in mind is that Smart, along with his other friends, started developing this theory of identity theory, okay? And he started basically saying that the brain has mental processes that directly match any kind of mental states that we have. All right, they're the same. Basically, what he's arguing, and that's called as the identity theory, or it's also called Australian materialism. Okay. Now let's have a look at a summary of everything before we get into reading the text. So let's consider these after images. Pause the video, stare at each of them, and then tell me who you see. Well, Smart starts from a reflection on what it is to see an after image. It's a brief reference of it. And as soon as he does that, he then starts exploring, well, how do I describe this phenomenon? What's the best way to describe it? Because really, we're not reflecting on what the after image is. We're trying to use the after image as a way for exploring how the brain works, and then asking the deeper questions: what is mind? What is brain? What is body? The usual questions of mind and body's kind of thinking. All right, so start off, and then we look at this, and we're going, look, he starts thinking about how he sees an after image. Stare at this one for 30 seconds and tell me what you see. All right, and once he's done that, he kind of starts reflecting, and he develops four hypotheses. Now, number one and number two aren't elaborated on the text. They're covered, but they're not elaborated. So I'm just going to change this word here to elaborated on. because we briefly encounter them in the introduction, but we don't really read over them at length. All right. And the first one is when I see this after image, perhaps I am just seeing nothing. And he references a very, very famous philosopher called Wittgenstein. And Wittgenstein says there are words which are just simply interjections, expressions of how we feel that don't really mean anything. So imagine if I hit myself with a hammer, I'm going to say, ow, ha, ah, I'm going to say these words. But they don't have any kind of internal meaning. They're just reactions to something that happens, reactions that describe nothing. So what if this after image and seeing the after image is nothing but some kind of reaction, which doesn't really mean anything. In fact, he goes on to say it's almost like a wince or a shake of the hand. It's a behaviour, but a behaviour that doesn't really describe anything or have any meaning. That's the first hypothesis. Take a note. All right, now the second one is much more interesting. And last year in our curriculum, we did a lot of reading of this guy called Armstrong, but we're not reading Armstrong this we're not reading Armstrong in the study design anymore. We've moved over to SMART. But I will give you a little bit of Armstrong's theory so you can kind of get what's meant by an agitation condition, or a condition would be a better thing, a better word for behaviours that aren't necessarily related to being agitated. Now, it's not actually covered in the reading, but to get a grasp of it, let's imagine that a glass we know is exhibiting this type of behavior. It's highly structured and it's functionary. I can use it. So if I'm describing the glass's behavior from a behaviorist point of view, I can say, hey, look, you know, it's a piece of glass. It's something I can use. However, most of us from our prior experience know that the glass has a predisposition towards being fragile. In other words, it's a fragile thing. Yet it may not have exhibited the behavior. So this guy Armstrong and another guy called Ryle come along and say, look, from the point of view of behavior, we can argue that things have a disposition to behave a certain way, though they might not show it. Take a note. Now, this language is still about behavior, okay? It's still about behavior and using behavior to describe what goes on, but it's also an acknowledgement of internal states, all right? The arrangement of the glass molecules creates the fragile disposition, which lets it shatter under the right condition, okay? So it's an acknowledgement that there is an internal state in there, but we're still using behavior to describe what could happen or what hasn't happened yet, right? Now, so we can kind of think about our mental states as dispositions to behave in a particular way. But going to directly where SMART is assuming that you've got a lot of this prior knowledge about what Armstrong and Ryle had said about internal dispositions or internal mental states. But let's just really quickly sum up what he says, and he only says it in about a sentence. If you activate the disposition, you show the behavior, okay? So if the right, and this is the important word, condition comes along and triggers the disposition, then you show the behavior. Now, what if seeing this after image is just you being placed in the right condition in order to trigger the behavior? Now, he goes on and he really kind of explains this a bit better when he looks at what we call like an agitation condition. What are the conditions that are going to agitate me and make me display the behaviors of being agitated? And as you can tell, one of those conditions would be pinched by sharp claws in the nose. That would really, really hurt, wouldn't it? But obviously you'd show the behavior, which you hadn't shown before, because the right condition would come along, and that would be an agitation condition. Likewise, a happiness condition, well, you know, the right condition comes along, triggers the disposition for you to behave in a happy way, and you express different behaviors. You get what I mean? So take a note. Okay, and the third one is, well, okay, what if I'm really reporting? What if this after image is what we call an irreducible psychical? This is what happens. I really wish he didn't use the word psycho. I wish he used the word psychological, but he says psychical. an irreducible psychical something. In other words, something that can only be explained from the point of view of mental phenomena. In other words, it's just like Descartes' mind, a spiritual substance, something that occurs in the thinking thing that can never, ever, and I'm going to put a cross here, so we can never, ever be translated into the language and the logic of how the physical world works. All right? Oh. All right. Do you get it? Never. In other words, it can't be translated into the brain. It can't be translated as the brain functioning in a particular way because the purely psychical behavior has nothing to do with physical behavior. It occurs in a different realm. Take a note. All right, and the last one, which gels the most with identity theory and with Australian materialism, is, of course, what if what I'm observing is purely a physical phenomena, it's a mental state that can be easily explained using the laws of physics and the physical world, and it's basically where what happens in the brain directly corresponds with the mental state of which, when I see the after image, it happens. So basically the two are one and the same thing. It's just obviously I experience the mental state differently. I don't experience it with direct knowledge of what happens in the brain, but basically as the brain does X, mental state does Y, and that produces a corresponding phenomena, right? So take a note. All right. So obviously you can see which ones he's going to reject because you know from your prior knowledge that this guy is a identity theorist or an Australian materialist, okay? So the first thing he says, look, something's happening. You know, when I close my eyes and I see that after image, look, I reject the first hypothesis because I can't say that I'm expressing nothing because clearly I'm experiencing something. Clearly something's happening. It's just nonsense, all right? And what I should point out is I'm separating the hypotheses from their rejections, but in the writing he says, here's the first hypothesis rejected, second hypothesis rejected. So he does them he doesn't do them in separate bits. He doesn't outline them first and then reject all of them in another block. He outlines the first one, rejects it, and moves on, okay? But for the sake of clarity, we're just writing things down like this. In the second one, he says, look, it's a very strange condition. Like, what kind of strange condition would actually generate the behavior of seeing the after image, all right? In the case of pain, it's pretty clear to see that there are pretty well-known categories of behavior that allow us to say, yes, you are seeing pain, all right? And these behaviors are pretty typical and also pretty average and pretty common amongst many different people. So we can describe the pain through its behaviors, but nobody really grasps the process of seeing an image through the process of describing its behavior. And when you think about it from the point of view of behaviorism, how can you, when obviously seeing the image is obviously a purely mental state? It's what you see versus what another person sees. So how can you objectively describe the behavior of seeing the after image? You can't do it. So take a note. Then he rejects the second hypothesis, the third hypothesis, using some pretty, well, not complex theories. They're actually quite easy to get, but new theories, okay? And he says, look, we look at what actually happens. We need to reflect on the simple process of Occam's razor, and here it is.
Gentleman thinker. Philosophical concepts explained in brief in a posh English accent. Occam's razor.
Oops. Play.
Gentleman thinker. Philosophical concepts explained in brief in a posh English accent. Occam's razor. Developed by William of Ockham, who looked a lot like Christopher Walken, Occam's razor is the principle of philosophical parsimony. In Latin, it's entiar non sunt multiplicanda praeter necessitatem. Entities should not be multiplied beyond necessity. What that means is we shouldn't make assumptions or postulate the existence of things that are surplus to requirement. For instance, if you have a working theory of gravity that explains why objects fall towards the center of the Earth, you don't then need to say objects fall because of gravity, and there are invisible demons that pull things towards the floor in order to break them. The demons in that theory don't do any work. They are superfluous, sort of extra nonsense, so we don't need them in our account of things. Occam's razor says cut them out. By the way, you'll see two different spellings of Occam. Occam is a village in Surrey, that's the original spelling. Occam is the Latinized version of it. Subscribe to PhilosophyTube for more from the...
Okay, so could you just spend a couple of minutes writing down your definition of Occam's razor, please? Alright, so hopefully your definition basically says Occam's razor is when you have a thorough and very simple principle that can explain in all of its entirety something that happens or something that occurs. You don't need to attach additional ideas to it, especially when those ideas don't do any extra work or don't perform any extra function over and above the original idea. Alright? Now that's really important from the point of view of an Australian materialist or an identity theorist. Alright? And let's look at this. He clearly dismisses what he calls nomological danglers. Nomological danglers are the people who add different names and different principles on top of the already existing simple, sufficient principle. Okay? Now let's go back to what was highlighted in this video. If you have a theory of gravity that accounts for just about everything you see, you don't need to then have the demon, right, to further explain it, because basically the demon is an extra idea that doesn't really add any kind of additional insight into how gravity works. So get rid of it, because, and also, you know, you can't prove it. You also need to assume too that the theory of gravity is much more of a simple and easily observable, highly testable. It's a much better theory that doesn't require any extra bits. And the weaker theory would be the demon, because obviously you can't test it. It's got a lot of other weaknesses to it. So not only is it superfluous and unnecessary, it's not as strong. Okay. Now, our man, Smart, says if you were to come along and just add those extra ideas, like maybe the mind is a psychical process or epiphenomenalism, right? Basically, you're just a nomological dangler. You're taking a new idea, an extra idea that you can see, and you're just dangling it in front of another idea, which is a much better, simpler idea, which does this, all the work, including the work that your other idea, the more crazy idea, is also doing. Okay, so take a note. So let me just clearly define what nomological dangler means again. Nomos means name. Logos means the language or words or logic that we use to account for it. Nomological means name logic. That's what it means. And a dangler means obviously someone who puts something in front of you. So a nomological dangler is someone who dangles the superfluous, unnecessary, and probably weaker concept in front of you, and also dangle the required, stronger, necessary, singular concept in front of you. Dangles both. The nomological dangling is just the dangling of the extra unnecessary concept. Okay, take a note. So from his point of view, dualism, epiphenomenalism, it's superfluous, it's overdone, it's too much. It's an unnecessary idea. And you can always tell if it's unnecessary because it's weaker and it doesn't do any extra work. And it's harder to test, all right, from a scientific point of view. So remember the idea of Occam's razor and nomological dangling. And from his point of view, kind of psychical argument or any argument that gives you the extra idea you don't need is just useless, because it's just pointless, it's overdone. Or look up the word superfluous, you know what I mean. Take a note. So anyone who's been paying attention will know that the argument that ends up being accepted is argument number 4, that mental states have directly corresponding physical states, that the mind and the brain are the same. Maybe we're just using different types of language to account for our mental experiences, and different language to explain our physical neurological phenomena, but basically they are one and the same thing, just have different language to describe them, and bang, that's the hypothesis he accepts. All right, so let's take let's have a bit of a reading. Now, of course, this is going to be much more confusing than the summary, but you should get it. All right. It's confusing because he's talking in a language which is in the 1950s. He's talking about things and references to other theory that we don't get yet because we haven't studied them. So just go with it and I'll explain it as we go through. All right. Sensations and brain processes. Suppose that I have reported that I have at this moment a roundish, blurry-edged after image which is yellowish towards its edge and is orange towards its center. What is it that I am reporting? One answer to the question might be that I am not reporting anything, that when I say it looks to me as though there is a roundish yellowy orange patch of light on the wall, I'm experiencing a sort of temptation, a temptation to say that there is a roundish yellowish orange patch on the wall, though I may know that there is not such a patch on the wall at all. This is perhaps Wittgenstein's view in the Philosophical Investigations. There's the reference. Similar when I report. Right, so what he's basically saying is here, and he's going on to say it again. He talks about the wince, sophisticated wince. But he's basically saying, how Wittgenstein says there are behaviors or kind of languages or things that we do that don't really mean anything, like the ooh and the ouch. Well, maybe that's what seeing the after image is, or maybe that's what reporting seeing the after image is. Okay. Similarly, when I report pain, I'm not really reporting anything, or if you like, I'm reporting a queer sense of reporting. But I'm doing a sort of sophisticated wince. Ouch, this hurts is a sophisticated wince, but doesn't mean anything. See paragraph 244. The verbal expression of pain replaces crying and does not describe it. You get it? I like that. The verbal expression of pain, according to Wittgenstein, replaces crying but does not describe it, nor does it describe anything else. There you go. I prefer most of the time to discuss an after image than pain because the word pain brings in something which is irrelevant to my purpose, the notion of distress. So I'm saying this concept of distress, it's not really necessary for me to develop the rest of my argument. I think that he is in pain entitles that he is in distress. That is, that he is in a certain agitation condition. Remember we were talking about conditions that trigger behaviors because we have the disposition to behave that way? That's all he's really referring to. All right, so now he's moved on to that idea of agitation conditions. He's dismissed the idea of the ulch thing because he knows something's actually happening. Now he's going on to say, oh, maybe there is a condition here that's triggering the behavior. Similar to say that I am pain, maybe more than replace pain in behavior. So he's basically saying, well, maybe that's a bit redundant because maybe we could say that there might be something more than just this pain behavior. Something is quite non-mysterious, being in agitation condition and also susceptible to behavior analysis. All right, sorry, I'm wrong. I'm skipping ahead. So he's saying, look, pain can be just basically an agitation condition. So I see the condition that has created the agitated behaviors, and I can just use behavior analysis to study it. Can you please take a note? This suggestion I wish, if possible, to avoid is a different one. So the suggestion, or wish, if possible, to avoid is a different one, namely that I am in pain is a genuine report, and that what it reports is irreducibly psychical something. So he's saying this is the one that I really want to avoid the most, okay? Which is basically that an irreducible psychical something that cannot be reduced to the physical world. And similarly, the suggestion I wish to resist is to also say that I have a yellowish orange after image is to report something irreducibly psychical. So he doesn't want to say that this is actually an irreducible psychical situation. What I do wish to resist, why do I wish to resist this suggestion? So why do I want to move past or reject the idea of an irreducibly psychical explanation? Mainly because of Occam's razor, it seems to me that science is increasingly giving us a viewpoint where organisms are able to be seen as physico-chemical mechanisms. It seems that even the behavior of man himself will one day be explicable in the mechanistic terms. So that's pretty logical. We said that before. We might not be able to fully understand the psychico-chemical or the physico-chemical mechanisms that trigger behavior, but he believes that ultimately they are, and we'll find out in the future. There does seem to be, so far as science is concerned, nothing in the world but increasingly complex arrangements of physical constituents. So we're saying molecules, cells, atoms. We're starting to understand the world purely from a materials perspective in terms of how they interact. All except for one place in consciousness. So we're saying we cannot yet account for consciousness from the physico-chemical mechanistic perspective. Take a note. That is, for a full description of what is going on in a man, you would have to mention not only the physical processes in his tissue, glands, nervous system, and so forth, but also his states of consciousness, his visual, auditory, and tactile sensations, his aches and his pains. That these should be correlated. Now, remember what correlation means. Correlation does not mean cause and effect. Correlation just means that there is a tendency for one behavior to occur when another does. There is a tendency for one thing to occur when another does, okay? So that these should be correlated with brain behavior processes does not help to say that they are correlated. It's to say that they are something over and above. You cannot correlate something with itself. So here he's kind of rejecting the idea that mental states are correlated with physical states, because you cannot say that mental states exist over and above or are different to physical states, though they occur basically at the same time. You cannot correlate something with itself. You correlate footprints with burglars, but not Bill Sykes, the burglar, with Bill Sykes, the burglar. So in other words, he's saying, if your mental behavior or your conscious behavior is the same as the brain process, you know, the two are doing the same thing, then you can't say it's a correlation. Basically, they are just the same thing. So don't use this language of correlation. So sensation states of consciousness do seem to be the sort of thing left outside the physicalist picture. And for various reasons, I cannot believe that this can be so. So he's saying, look, I know that most of us experience sensations and we understand sensations and consciousness from a language that's very different from the way that we describe brain-based phenomena, but he just doesn't believe that this can be so. Take a note. That everything should be explicable in terms of physics, together with the course of description of the ways in which the parts are put together. Roughly, biology is to physics as radio engineering is to electromagnetism, except the occurrence of sensations seems to me to be frankly unbelievable. Such sensations would be nomological danglers, all right, to use Wegel's expression. In other words, he's saying, oh, look, if we try and use the other language, it's kind of nomological dangling. It's not often realized how odd would be the laws whereby these nomological danglers would dangle. It is sometimes asked, why can't there be psychophysical laws which are of a novel sort, such as the laws of electricity and magnetism were novelties from the standpoint of view of Newtonian mechanics? Certainly, we are pretty sure in the future to come across new ultimate laws of a very novel, different type, but I expect them to relate simple constituents. For example, whatever ultimate particles are then in vogue. I cannot believe that ultimate laws of nature would relate simple constituents to configurations consisting of perhaps billions of neurons, and goodness knows how many billions of ultimate particles, all put together for all the world as though their main purpose in life is to be a negative feedback mechanism of some complicated sort. Let's have a read of that again. I cannot believe that ultimate laws of nature could relate simple constituents to configurations consisting of perhaps billions of neurons, and goodness knows how many billions of ultimate particles, all put together for all the world as though their main purpose in life was to be a negative feedback mechanism for of a complicated sort. Okay. That seems confusing, but it will make sense when I read the next couple of sentences, okay? Such ultimate laws would be like nothing so far as we know in science. They have a queer smell to them. I'm just unable to believe in the nomological danglers themselves, or the laws whereby they would dangle. If any such philosophical arguments seem to compel us to believe in such things, I would suspect a catch in the argument. In any case, it is It is the object of this paper to show that there are no philosophical arguments which compel us to be dualists. All right, so he's going to go against dualism, and he's going to say, look, he's going to basically say some aspects of, if you read this and you get this in an exam, he's basically saying, look, some aspects of physics he just doesn't believe in ever. Like, he's not just saying that you have this really complex brain arrangement, and he doesn't believe that this complicated brain arrangement of so many miraculous things is just structured in order to create a negative feedback loop. That's not right. You must be doing more. And he's saying, look, the laws of how the brain works would be so far above our current science today that it would queer, weird, strange smell to them if it came across them. He's just unable to believe, too, that the nomological danglers themselves also have the right answer. And those nomological danglers are the epiphenomenists or the dualists, right? If any philosophical system compelled us to believe in such things, I would see that there's a catch in the argument. So if there was a philosophical system that actually argued for dualism or for epiphenomenalism in a new way, taking into account a new understanding of how the brain works, well, there'd be a catch. You'd find some kind of contradiction. It wouldn't be purely simple, would it? So in any case, the object of the paper is then to reject any non-philosophical arguments that compel us to move towards dualism or epiphenomenalism. Okay? Take a note. Now, that's really complex, but don't be surprised if you get this huge, complex, really yuck sentence in an exam, which says that he cannot believe the ultimate laws of nature could relate simple constituents to configurations consisting of billions of neurons, all put together for all the world, as though their main purpose in life was to be a negative feedback mechanism of complicated sort. To tell you the truth, I think what he's just basically saying is that the brain is much more complex than a negative feedback mechanism. However, he goes on to say, science will move past that, and it does, from our perspective now, to seem kind of strange. But basically, that's the only way I can make sense of that. Don't be surprised if you get some really bizarre quote like that in an exam. All right, we named and defined and interrelated key terms to come up with a hypothesis. We then critically evaluated those hypotheses from Smart's point of view, and now we understand the kind of identity hypothesis which he put forth, which is basically, is mental state equals physical state of brain. Okay. He does also acknowledge that when we fully come up with the understanding of how the brain is structured materially and works materially to account for conscious behavior, he thinks that'll come across as weird, which is this bottom section's argument. However, he still thinks that basically we will one day find out the material laws of the brain that account for consciousness, and he's going to reject dualism. All right, that's it.